We like to think we know what makes a civilization great. Skyscrapers scraping the sky, armies stretching across continents, artificial intelligence humming in our pockets. On the surface, these are the signs of progress, the proof that we've advanced further than anyone before us. They're the things we point to and say, look, this is greatness, but what if we've been fooling ourselves? What if greatness isn't about what towers over the horizon, but about something far less visible, something that slips away the moment the lights go out? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Every civilization in history thought it was the pinnacle. Rome had its legions, Egypt had its pyramids, Mesopotamia its cities of brick and clay. They all believed they had built something eternal. And yet what's left today? Broken stone, scattered ruins, and myths that only whisper of what once was. The lesson is simple and chilling. Greatness, at least the way we like to define it, never lasts. So if we measure our worth only by monuments, what happens when they crumble? If we define ourselves by wealth, what happens when the markets collapse? If we hang our identity on technology, what happens when the grid goes dark? Greatness, measured in steel, stone, and silicon, is fragile because those things can be lost in an instant. And when they vanish, the illusion of permanence vanishes with them. That's the danger of misdefining greatness. It blinds us to the possibility of collapse. It convinces us that as long as the towers stand and the data flows, our civilization is safe. But history tells us otherwise. The ruins we marvel at today were once thriving cities, full of people who thought they had outsmarted time. They didn't. And if we cling to the same narrow definition of greatness, there's no reason to believe we will either. When we think about great civilizations, our minds tend to go straight to the same set of images. Colossal empires, stretching across continents, glittering cities filled with markets and palaces, massive armies marching in step, their banners raised high. Writing carved into stone tablets or inscribed in scrolls that somehow survived thousands of years. And of course the monuments, those jaw-dropping constructions of stone and sweat that seem to defy time itself. That's what we're taught in school, and that's what we carry into adulthood. Greatness equals size, power, and permanence. It feels natural to think this way because it's easy. You can see a pyramid. You can touch the wall of a ruined fortress. You can stand inside a colosseum and feel the echo of voices that once filled the air. These things are tangible, and in a world where most of the past has crumbled into dust, the things that remain visible seem like the most obvious markers of greatness. But the danger of this definition is that it tricks us into believing the biggest and loudest civilizations are the only ones worth remembering. Take Rome, for example. Rome is practically the textbook definition of a great civilization. At its height, the Roman Empire controlled land from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the Middle East. It built aqueducts, amphitheaters, roads that still exist today. It codified laws, spread Latin, and left behind monuments that continue to dominate tourism brochures. Rome's greatness feels undeniable. But let's pause here. Why do we really remember Rome? Is it because of the ideas it left behind, or because its ruins are still standing? If every Roman building had been swallowed by earthquakes and erosion, would we still talk about Rome the same way? Now consider Egypt. When people hear the word civilization, they picture pyramids rising from the desert, the Sphinx staring out into the horizon, hieroglyphics carved into temple walls. Egypt seems immortal, but the truth is, what we admire about Egypt today are mostly the tombs of its kings. We've defined an entire civilization by its funerary architecture. Daily life in ancient Egypt, the complexities of its farmers, scribes, merchants, and mothers, all of that is less visible. What survives is stone, and because it survives, we equate it with greatness. Then there's Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization. Here, humanity is said to have invented writing, codified law, and built the first cities. That's a pretty compelling resume. But again, why do we give Mesopotamia such a privileged place in the story? It's partly because clay tablets survive better than wood or cloth. Thousands of years later, we can still read Hammurabi's code. We can still see cuneiform wedges pressed into hardened clay. That endurance creates the illusion of permanence and importance. But how many other cultures invented laws, systems, and technologies that vanished because they didn't write them into stone? This is the bias of visibility, and it shapes everything we believe about history. We mistake durability for greatness. We assume that the cultures who left behind big, heavy, nearly indestructible things must have been the most advanced. But in reality, that's just what happened to survive. Civilizations that built with wood, bamboo, or earth, materials far more suited to their environment, are largely invisible to us now. We don't call them great, not because they weren't, but because nature erased their evidence. Here's the dark twist. By tying greatness to what survives, we create a distorted lens of history. Rome's aqueducts and colosseums still stand, but Rome itself burned, fractured, and collapsed into centuries of chaos. Egypt's pyramids are still impressive, but the dynasties that built them crumbled, leaving behind endless cycles of invasion and decline. Mesopotamia gave us cities, but it also gave us salinized soil, exhausted farmland, and urban collapses so severe that entire centers of power were abandoned. The very civilizations we call great were also fragile, flawed, and impermanent. Their monuments trick us into forgetting that. Think about it. If greatness is measured by size, then Rome was great until it wasn't. If greatness is measured by power, then Egypt was great until foreigners ruled it for centuries. If greatness is measured by invention, then Mesopotamia was great until its lands turned to desert and its cities were reduced to mounds of dirt. We define greatness in terms that only highlight the high points while ignoring the crashes that followed. That's not greatness, it's a selective memory. The irony is that our obsession with monuments blinds us to other measures of civilization. While we marvel at Rome's aqueducts, we ignore the countless other societies that developed equally sophisticated water systems out of bamboo, wood, or clay pipes that have long since rotted away. While we admire Egypt's pyramids, we dismiss cultures that never built giant tombs but may have had social systems far more equitable or sustainable. While we celebrate Mesopotamia's writing, we overlook oral traditions in Africa, Polynesia, or the Americas that carried knowledge across centuries without stone or ink. Here's the real problem. We've equated permanence with progress, and in doing so, we've missed the bigger picture. Civilizations that expanded endlessly, built enormous monuments and raised massive armies often collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. Meanwhile, smaller, less visible societies that lived in balance with their environment quietly endured for far longer. Yet we rarely call those societies great. Why? Because they didn't leave behind skyscrapers or stone faces staring from the desert. This way of thinking has consequences for us today. We point to our skyscrapers, our satellites, our global cities, and declare ourselves the greatest civilization in history. But if permanence is the standard, are we really so different from Rome, Egypt, or Mesopotamia? Our steel towers will rust. Our data will vanish with the failure of electricity. Our cities, if left untended, would crumble into forests and fields in a matter of centuries. What would survive? Maybe a few monuments of concrete and stone, maybe plastics embedded in the soil, maybe a vague trace of satellites orbiting above. Is that what will define our greatness? The unsettling truth is that by clinging to this old definition, empire, city, army, writing, monument, we're repeating the same mistake as the civilizations before us. We're assuming that what looks grand now will last forever. But history teaches us otherwise. The so-called great civilizations are remembered because they left ruins, not because they endured. And if that's our standard, then we're building for the same kind of memory, broken fragments admired by future archaeologists, with little left of who we really were. So maybe the real question isn't how we define greatness. Maybe the question is why we've been so eager to define it in ways that blind us to collapse. Rome burned, Egypt eroded, Mesopotamia fell to dust, and we, surrounded by our glass towers and glowing screens, are not immune. Rome is often the first name that comes to mind when we say great civilization. It feels almost synonymous with greatness. An empire that stretched across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, roads and aqueducts that survive to this day, a system of law and governance that influenced the modern world. Rome had it all: wealth, power, culture, military strength. To walk through the Colosseum today is to feel the ghost of a world that seemed unstoppable. But here's the catch: Rome didn't last. The very things that made Rome appear great also seeded its downfall. Its armies overextended, draining resources and sparking endless wars at its borders. Its wealth flowed into the hands of the elite, leaving the majority of citizens struggling. Political corruption hollowed out the republic and later the empire. Even its monuments, those symbols of permanence, became stone quarries for later generations who dismantled them. The empire that thought it would rule forever collapsed in fire, famine, and invasion. And yet, because the ruins are still visible, we call Rome great. That's the illusion. We remember the aqueducts, the marble, the grandeur, but we forget the slave labor that built it all. The blood spilled in the Colosseum, the fragility of a society that believed too much in its own invincibility. Rome's greatness, if defined only by its monuments, was never as solid as the stones suggest. When people think of ancient greatness, Egypt is almost unavoidable. The pyramids, the Sphinx, the Valley of the Kings, structures so massive and mysterious that they've endured for thousands of years. Hieroglyphs cover temple walls, telling stories of gods and pharaohs. Egypt looks eternal, like it discovered the secret of permanence. But that's another illusion. The truth is that we remember Egypt mainly for its tombs. The pyramids weren't built for the people. They were built to glorify kings. They represented power and divine authority, not fairness or prosperity for ordinary citizens. And while the pyramids still stand, the society that created them went through endless cycles of collapse and rebirth. Egypt was conquered by Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. Its greatness was fragile, repeatedly overwritten by foreign powers. Even the pyramids themselves, icons of stability, show cracks. Many others fell apart, eroded, or were stripped for building materials. And the wealth required to construct them drained the economy, burdening the population with unimaginable labor and taxes. From a distance, we see a great civilization. Up close, we see an unequal society where survival for many was sacrificed for the immortality of a few. So why do we call Egypt great? Because stone survives. Because sand preserved what wood, cloth, and human lives could not. Egypt's greatness is a story written in limestone. But the human cost and the fragility beneath remind us that greatness built on monuments is only skin deep. Mesopotamia is often called the cradle of civilization. It gave us the wheel, the first known writing system, and the earliest codified laws. Cities like Uruk and Babylon were marvels of their age, with ziggurats towering over, marketplaces and canals that fed sprawling populations. By textbook standards, Mesopotamia checks every box for greatness: cities, armies, agriculture, writing, monumental architecture. But look closer, and the cracks appear. The very soil that supported Mesopotamian civilization also betrayed it. Irrigation, one of its great innovations, slowly poisoned the land with salt. Crops failed, harvests shrank, populations starved, cities that once thrived became uninhabitable. What was once the shining heart of human advancement turned into a wasteland of dust and ruins. The laws of Hammurabi survive, written in stone, but the society that enforced them fell apart. And let's not forget the violence. Mesopotamia's city-states were in constant conflict, warring for dominance. Kingdoms rose and fell in rapid succession. Babylon was conquered, rebuilt, conquered again. Assyria ruled with terror, building its greatness on fear and bloodshed. The ziggurats remain as outlines of glory, but the human experience was marked by instability, exploitation, and collapse. Mesopotamia is remembered as great, not because it endured, but because clay tablets and carved stone endured. We mistake that survival for permanence. In reality, it was fragile, an empire of mud brick walls washed away by time. The cradle of civilization was also its first warning. Greatness built on fragile foundations doesn't last. When we picture the past, we don't imagine the everyday lives of ordinary people. We imagine the ruins, the massive blocks of stone, the inscriptions carved deep into rock, the monuments so heavy and immovable they outlast centuries. That's how history has been taught to us, through what we can still see and touch: the pyramids, the Parthenon, the Great Wall, the Colosseum. These relics dominate not just landscapes, but our imagination. And here's the problem: they distort it because survival doesn't equal importance. What endures in stone isn't necessarily what defined a civilization. It's simply what refused to vanish. And that gives us a dangerous bias. We treat monuments as proof of greatness while ignoring everything else that was fragile, fleeting, or deliberately erased. Think about how much of human life happens outside of stone. Food systems, music, oral, traditions, textiles, woodwork, medicine, rituals, and stories. These things form the heartbeat of ancient societies, yet almost none of it survives. Papyrus decays, wood rots, cloth disintegrates, voices disappear, but limestone remains. Granite endures, clay tablets can still be read. And because those things survive, they dominate our narrative. That's why when we think of ancient Egypt, we think pyramids. When we think of Greece, we think marble columns. When we think of Rome, we think colosseums and aqueducts. These are the skeletons of civilizations, not the flesh. They tell us a story of scale and spectacle, but not necessarily of values, culture, or resilience. And by elevating them, we reduce civilizations to their biggest rocks. Here's the dark twist. This bias not only shapes how we remember the past, it blinds us to the full scope of it. Imagine two civilizations. One builds giant stone monuments that survive for millennia, but collapses quickly under the weight of inequality and environmental strain. The other never builds in stone at all, instead developing sustainable practices, rich oral traditions, and social harmony that endure for thousands of years, but leave almost nothing behind. Which one gets remembered as great? The one with ruins? Which one actually lived better, longer, maybe even wiser? The one erased by time? That's why history feels like a parade of empires obsessed with scale. Egypt, Greece, Rome, China. It's not because they were the only civilizations worth studying. It's because they happened to leave behind the most indestructible evidence. Entire worlds built from less permanent materials are gone, forgotten, invisible to us. And in their absence, we tell ourselves they never mattered. This also explains why lost civilizations capture our imagination so powerfully. Whenever a new discovery surfaces, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey or Mount Padang in Indonesia, it rattles us, because it reminds us that what survives is a lottery, not a complete record. Those places sat buried and forgotten for thousands of years, invisible until the right person stumbled on them. How many more have been erased forever? How many stories will never even enter our textbooks because the evidence dissolved before we could see it? Our bias towards stone also warps how we define progress. We assume the bigger the monument, the more advanced the society. The higher the pyramid, the stronger the civilization. But is that true? Rome's Colosseum is still standing, but it was built on the backs of slaves, its glory powered by human suffering. Mesopotamian ziggurats impress us with their scale, but the societies that raised them collapsed under environmental stress. Stone is a poor measure of wisdom. It only measures weight. And if we're honest, we do the same thing today. We equate glass towers and sprawling highways with progress. We assume skyscrapers equal advancement, that military parades equal stability, that satellites mean superiority. But these are just a version of pyramids and colosseums, visible, durable, impressive. Strip them away, and the real question remains, how well does the society actually function? How well does it endure? Here's the haunting lesson. If our civilization vanished tomorrow, what would survive? Our skyscrapers would eventually crumble, our roads would crack, our technology would rust or vanish in a heartbeat. The servers, carrying our knowledge, would dissolve without constant maintenance. What might remain? Maybe a handful of stone monuments, maybe some reinforced concrete, maybe plastics embedded in sediment layers. Future archaeologists might look at those remnants and call us great. But would that judgment mean anything if the society behind them had destroyed itself? By focusing on what's visible, we risk misunderstanding greatness altogether. We assume that what we can still see must have been the center of life. But ask yourself, was Rome truly defined by the Colosseum or by the daily struggles of its citizens? Was Egypt defined by pyramids or by the farmers who worked the Nile? Was Mesopotamia defined by ziggurats or by the countless people who lived and died without leaving their names in clay? The monuments trick us into remembering civilizations as if they were only their elites. Kings, emperors, generals, priests, the ones who had the power to build in stone, the ones who demanded labor from thousands to raise monuments in their honor. But the real civilization was in the lives of the ordinary, lives that rarely survive in the record. By remembering only the monuments, we remember power, not people, and that distortion carries into the present. We still define ourselves by what we think will last. We build taller, bigger, heavier, always seeking permanence. But permanence isn't greatness, it's just durability. A skyscraper can outlast a generation, but if the society that built it collapses, what does it prove? A monument can endure millennia, but if it's just the tomb of a ruler who drained his people to build it, is that greatness, or is it tragedy carved in stone? This is why we need to question our bias. Because the civilizations we admire most were also fragile, violent, and temporary. Their monuments survived, but their people did not. If we continue to define greatness by what leaves behind the biggest ruins, we will never see the full spectrum of human history. We'll keep worshipping skeletons and ignoring the living bodies that gave them shape. The uncomfortable truth is that greatness is not in the stones. It's in the stories, the knowledge, the resilience, and those are the very things most likely to vanish, which means the civilizations we dismiss as lesser may have been far wiser than we'll ever know. They just didn't carve their memory into granite. When we talk about great civilizations, the conversation almost always gravitates towards stone and steel, the pyramids, the Great Wall, the Colosseum. But maybe that's the wrong place to start. Because what if greatness isn't about what's carved into rock, but what's carved into memory? What if the most advanced civilizations weren't the ones that built the biggest monuments, but the ones that figured out how to endure without collapsing under their own weight? It sounds strange because we're conditioned to look for permanence. We equate survival with stone. Yet some of the most remarkable societies left behind no skyscrapers, no massive armies, no sprawling empires. Their achievements weren't written in granite or marble. They were written in culture, in resilience, in the ways they balanced with the world around them. And because those legacies don't fossilize as easily, we tend to ignore them. Take the indigenous cultures of North America, for instance. Long before European colonization, vast networks of trade, diplomacy, and sustainable farming existed across the continent. The Iroquois Confederacy governed itself with a system of councils and checks that some historians believe influenced the formation of modern democratic principles. But because they didn't build towering monuments of stone, their political sophistication is often dismissed or minimized in textbooks. Their greatness was in ideas, not pyramids. Or look to the Pacific, where Polynesian navigators mastered open ocean travel centuries before compasses, maps, or GPS. They read the stars, the currents, the flight paths of birds. They could sail thousands of miles of open water and land precisely on distant islands. That knowledge wasn't carved into stone. It was carried in memory, passed through chants, stories, and apprenticeship. It survived because it was lived, not built. But fragile as it was greatness all the same. And across Africa, oral dynasties preserved history, philosophy, and law in forms that Western scholars once dismissed as primitive, simply because they weren't written down. The griots of West Africa were living archives, able to recite genealogies, laws, and histories stretching back centuries. This was civilization measured not in monuments, but in memory. Fragile, yes, but no less sophisticated. And when colonizers erased or ignored those traditions, they dismissed entire cultures as if they had no history at all. Here's the darker truth. What disappears is often what mattered most. Ideas are fragile. Oral traditions can vanish in a single generation. Sustainable systems can collapse under conquest or climate change, leaving little trace behind. And so we remember the conquerors, the builders of heavy monuments, and we forget the cultures that may have been wiser, more balanced, or more enduring in their day. That raises a haunting question. Maybe greatness isn't what survives erosion, but what resists collapse. A society that builds stone pyramids but destroys its soil may look great to us, but it collapses in its own time. A society that leaves behind no stone monuments but lives in harmony with the land for thousands of years may not look great to us, but maybe it was far greater than we admit. Think about it. Which society is truly stronger? The one that lasts for a few centuries and leaves behind broken ruins, or the one that endures quietly, sustainably for millennia, leaving behind little but fertile land and living traditions? The first gets called great in textbooks. The second gets forgotten, but maybe we've got it backward. This is where the arrogance of our own civilization comes into play. We look at skyscrapers and satellites and call ourselves the most advanced in history. But we also face collapsing ecosystems, widening inequality, and the constant threat of self-destruction. Meanwhile, cultures we've ignored as primitive thrived for thousands of years without annihilating their environment. They didn't build towers of glass, but they built systems that endured. And isn't that a better definition of greatness? The uncomfortable part is that we may never fully recover these invisible legacies. Oral traditions lost are gone forever. Knowledge of plants, medicines, and ecologies erased by colonization can't always be reconstructed. We will never know the full depth of indigenous science, African philosophy, or Polynesian astronomy. And so our view of history remains warped, biased towards stone and silence. But here's the glimmer of hope. Fragments of those traditions still whisper to us. The Iroquois constitution, the navigational chants of Polynesia, the epics carried by West African griots. All of them remind us that greatness isn't limited to stone. It can live in memory, in culture, in the fragile threads that bind people together. And maybe, if we're willing to listen, they can still teach us something today. Because if greatness is only defined by what survives in ruins, then we've doomed ourselves to repeat the same cycles. Build, overreach, collapse, leave behind rubble. But if greatness is defined by resilience, balance, and wisdom, then maybe we still have a chance to build something that doesn't end in dust. Something that doesn't need to prove itself in monuments, because it proves itself in survival. That's the paradox. The civilizations we celebrate as great often destroyed themselves. The civilizations we forget may have been the ones that understood how to endure. And if we keep ignoring those lessons, if we keep worshipping stone instead of wisdom, we may find that our own skyscrapers become nothing more than future ruins, admired by archaeologists, but stripped of the society that built them. When we talk about civilizations, we like to imagine them as straight lines. They rise, they grow, they progress, and we inherit their achievements. It feels neat, ordered, logical. Rome passes on its law, Greece passes on its philosophy, Egypt leaves its pyramids. We take their torch and run with it, climbing higher on the ladder of progress. But history doesn't really work like that. If anything, history looks more like a heartbeat, up, down, up, down. Civilizations don't march forward forever. They cycle, they rise, peak, and fall. And almost always, the fall comes faster than the rise. Look at Rome. At its height, it was the superpower of the known world. Roads stretched thousands of miles, armies dominated battlefields, and the Mediterranean became what they proudly called Mare Nostrum, our sea. To a Roman citizen walking through marble forums, it must have felt like eternity had been achieved. Yet in just a few generations, the empire fractured, cities shrank, and knowledge that had once seemed permanent slipped into obscurity. Libraries burned, aqueducts crumbled, trade routes collapsed. The eternal city wasn't eternal after all. And Rome wasn't unique. Egypt's dynasties rose and fell like tides. Mesopotamia's city-states thrived, collapsed, and were rebuilt by conquerors. The Maya, who mapped the stars and built cities in the jungle, saw their urban centers abandoned and swallowed by forests. The Khmer Empire raised the sprawling wonder of Angkor Wat, only to watch it decline under the weight of war and shifting climate. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the earliest to build cities with grid systems and plumbing, simply vanished, leaving behind ruins that puzzled archaeologists for centuries. This is the pattern. Civilizations climb, often spectacularly, but they never stay at the top. They collapse, sometimes slowly over centuries, sometimes suddenly within a single generation. And the reasons vary: climate change, famine, war, disease, internal corruption, economic collapse. But the outcome is always the same. What once seemed permanent dissolves into dust. Why is that so hard for us to accept? Partly because we're trained to see the survivors. The pyramids survived, so Egypt looks eternal. Roman law influenced Europe, so Rome feels permanent. But in reality, for every great civilization we celebrate, dozens more rose and fell without leaving enough ruins for us to even know their names. History is biased toward survivors, not toward truth. The unsettling part is this: collapse isn't an exception, it's the rule. No matter how powerful or advanced, every civilization in history has faced decline. Some recover in new forms, others disappear entirely. And if that's the rule, then our own civilization is not exempt. The skyscrapers, the satellites, the endless flow of digital data, it all feels indestructible now. But so did Rome. So did Egypt. So did the Maya. The truth is, collapse is less about if and more about when. There's a strange arrogance in how we view ourselves. We imagine that because we have technology, medicine, and global communication, we've broken free from history's cycles. We see collapse as something that happened to others, primitive societies, ancient empires, cultures that didn't have our genius. But that's denial. The same forces that brought down civilizations before us, environmental strain, inequality, conflict, are already present today. We've just dressed them in modern clothes. Rome's overextension looks a lot like today's global supply chains, stretched thin and vulnerable. Egypt's dependence on the Nile mirrors our dependence on fossil fuels and stable climates. The Mayas' struggle with drought echoes our own fears about water scarcity. The Indus Valley's collapse may have been tied to shifting rivers. What happens if sea levels rise and drown our coasts? Different ages, different tools, same vulnerabilities. What makes this cycle even darker is that collapse often comes right after the peak. The very moment a society feels most secure, when its monuments are tallest and its wealth greatest, is often when the seeds of decline are already sprouting. Hubris sets in. Expansion overreaches. Resources are stretched. Inequality grows. The illusion of permanence makes leaders complacent, and then, suddenly, the cycle turns. What once looked unshakable falls apart, leaving future generations to marvel at the ruins and wonder, how could they let this happen? The answer is always the same. They thought they were different. The Romans thought they were eternal. The Egyptians thought their gods guaranteed stability. The Maya thought their cities would endure forever, and we, standing among our glass towers, surrounded by glowing screens, connected by invisible networks, think we've broken the pattern. But history whispers otherwise. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall. The cycle doesn't care about pride, technology, or monuments. It just continues, with or without us. When civilizations collapse, they rarely leave behind a neat explanation. Stones crumble, records burn, people scatter. What remains is often silence, but humans don't live well with silence. We tell stories, we wrap catastrophe in myth, in parable, in legend, and those myths survive in ways stone sometimes doesn't. If ruins are the skeletons of past civilizations, myths are the ghosts. They haunt us because they remember in symbols what our ancestors lived through in flesh. Take the great flood myths. They appear everywhere. Mesopotamia, India, Greece, Mesoamerica, North America, Africa, Polynesia. Nearly every culture has some version of the world drowning, the land swallowed, and only a handful of survivors carrying memory into the new age. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a flood that wiped out nearly all humanity. The Bible preserves the story of Noah's Ark. Hindu texts recall Manu, the first man, saved from waters that swallowed the earth. Indigenous tribes across the Americas tell of floods that erased whole peoples. Even the Yoruba of West Africa speak of water reshaping the world. Why do these stories echo across cultures separated by oceans and millennia? Because something happened. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters. Coastlines disappeared, settlements drowned. For people living at the water's edge, it must have felt like the world itself was collapsing. They had no satellites, no climate models, no geological understanding. They had memory. They had story. So they told their children, the waters came, the old world ended, and only a few survived. And that story, repeated for generations, fossilized into myth. Then there's Atlantis. Plato described it as a mighty civilization, wealthy, advanced, arrogant, and destroyed in a single day by catastrophe. Historians have debated whether Atlantis was allegory, a moral warning about hubris, but its persistence in human imagination speaks to something deeper. Atlantis is the ultimate memory of collapse, a society that thought it was untouchable, erased in an instant. Whether or not Plato drew from an actual event, perhaps the eruption of Thera in the Aegean, or memories of earlier floods, the point is clear. Civilizations fall, and sometimes all that survives is the story. The Norse had Ragnarok, not a flood, but a fire, a vision of gods battling, the sun swallowed, the world consumed in flame and reborn in ash. It's tempting to see this as pure mythic imagination. But the timing overlaps with real geological chaos in the north. Volcanic eruptions, long winters, famine. Maybe Ragnarok was memory of collapse dressed as cosmic war. The Maya told of suns that rose and fell, ages of creation ending in destruction before new ones began. Hindu cosmology divides time into yugas, vast cycles of rise and decline, golden ages followed by dark ones. Again, not just allegories, but perhaps cultural memories of cycles, of civilizations rising, thriving, and being broken by forces beyond their control. What these myths remind us is that collapse doesn't just leave ruins, it leaves scars in human memory. Scars that get passed down, generation after generation, until the details blur, but the warning remains. There was a time before, when people grew too proud, or the gods grew angry, or nature swallowed the land. That's how ancient people explained what they had lived through. And here's the haunting part. Myths often preserve truths that archaeology struggles to find. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that around 12,800 years ago, Earth suffered a sudden climatic shock, possibly from a comet fragment. Ice melted rapidly, floods swept across continents, megafauna went extinct. Archaeology gives us sediment layers, fossils, isotope charts. Myth gives us fire from the sky, floods, and a world reborn. Different languages, same memory. But because myths don't survive as stone, we've been conditioned to treat them as fantasy. Scholars long dismissed flood legends as coincidence, Atlantis as fable, Ragnarok as story. Yet these stories endure across cultures for a reason. They encode trauma, they hold memory, and in a way, they are the only surviving records of collapses so complete that nothing else remained. This creates a strange irony. The civilizations we call great are remembered because they left behind stone. But the civilizations we forget may still be whispering through myth. Invisible, fragile, easy to dismiss, yet possibly the truest record of how fragile human society really is. The pyramids show us what humans could build. Flood myths show us what humans could lose. So, what do we do with these myths today? Do we treat them as fairy tales, or do we listen to them as warnings? Because if history is a cycle, as the myths suggest, then we're not outside the story, we are inside it. Atlantis isn't just a legend, it's a mirror. The flood isn't just a memory, it's a possibility. Ragnarok isn't just a poem, it's a reminder that collapse feels like the end of the world when you're living through it. The myths tell us something archaeology often can't. Civilizations collapse suddenly, completely, and the survivors struggle to make sense of it. They also tell us another uncomfortable truth, that no civilization thinks it will be the one to fall. Every Atlantis believed it was untouchable. Every flood generation thought the waters would never rise. Every golden age assumed it would last forever. Until it didn't, and so the myths endure, waiting for us to listen. We like to believe we've broken the cycle. That collapse is a thing of the past, something that happened to ancient people who didn't know better. After all, look at us. We have satellites orbiting the planet. We've mapped the human genome. We can communicate across oceans in seconds. Our skyscrapers touch the sky. Our technology connects billions. Our military power is global. Surely, if any civilization deserves to be called great, it's this one. It's this one. But that's the same illusion every empire before us believed. Rome thought it was eternal. Egypt thought its gods guaranteed stability. The Maya thought their cosmic calendars would keep time forever. The truth is, we're not as different as we like to imagine. Our version of pyramids and colosseums just looks shinier, steel and glass instead of stone. And like those monuments of old, they give us a false sense of permanence. Think about our cities. From space, they glow like constellations, sprawling webs of light across continents. They feel indestructible, but they're only indestructible so long as power grids hum, supply chains flow, and climate remains stable. Cut the power for a few weeks, and those towers of glass become tombs of heat and darkness. Stop the supply of food and fuel for a few months, and the skyscraper becomes an empty husk. Our monuments are just as fragile as the ruins we marvel at, maybe even more so. And then there's our technology. We think the internet will preserve our knowledge forever, but digital data is more fragile than papyrus. Servers require constant maintenance. Code needs constant updates. Strip away the electricity and the fiber optic networks, and everything vanishes. Imagine an archaeologist 5,000 years from now. They wouldn't find our tweets, our databases, or our cloud storage. They'd find plastic buried in sediment, maybe some concrete foundations, maybe a few satellites still circling as dead husks above the planet. That would be our legacy. That would be our greatness. What about power? We measure greatness by wealth and armies. The United States, China, Europe, their GDPs and militaries feel like proof of supremacy. But Rome had the biggest army of its age. Egypt had wealth beyond measure. Mesopotamia had cities that dazzled their neighbors. All of them collapsed. Power isn't permanence, it's performance until it stops working. And when it stops, collapse comes quickly. If we define greatness as technology, what happens when the grid goes dark? If we define it as wealth, what happens when the markets crash? If we define it as monuments, what happens when climate change erodes the coasts and buries our cities under rising seas? If we've learned anything from the ruins of the past, it should be this: defining greatness by what looks indestructible is the surest path to being blindsided when it all falls apart. Here's the darker twist. We may already be closer to collapse than we think. Rising temperatures, shifting climates, mass extinctions, widening inequality, political instability. These are the same pressures that toppled civilizations before us. The difference is scale. Rome's collapse destabilized the Mediterranean. The Mayas' collapse reshaped Central America. Our collapse would destabilize the entire globe. The cycle hasn't stopped, it's just bigger now. And that's where the myths start whispering again. Atlantis swallowed by pride and water. The flood drowning the old world. Ragnarok, fire consuming gods and mortals alike. Maybe those weren't just stories of the past. Maybe they're warnings for the future. Because if we keep defining greatness by towers and tech, we're repeating the same mistake. We're building monuments instead of resilience. We're chasing permanence in stone and steel while ignoring the fragility of the systems that actually keep us alive: soil, water, air, balance. Here's the hardest question: what will survive of us? If archaeologists dig through our ruins 5,000 years from now, will they call us great? They might find plastic, steel beams, and nuclear waste sealed like time capsules. They might uncover the shells of our megacities, skeletal highways stretching across continents. They might even marvel at our ability to split the atom, to touch the stars. But will they see the collapse too? The abandoned coastal cities, the forests swallowing highways, the mass graves from wars and famine. Will our skyscrapers be remembered as triumphs or as warnings carved into concrete? Greatness, as we've defined it, is fragile. It's an illusion created by monuments and technology. And if we cling to that illusion, we risk becoming just another chapter in the cycle. Admired for our ruins, forgotten for our wisdom. Maybe it's time to redefine greatness. Not as the tallest building, the biggest army, or the most advanced tech, but as the ability to endure without collapse. Maybe true greatness is invisible. The ideas that survive in memory, the balance that sustains ecosystems, the resilience that allows a culture to last not for centuries, but for millennia. Because stone crumbles, steel rusts, data erases, but wisdom, if we choose to keep it, might outlive us all. When we ask, What makes a civilization great? The answers we've inherited come straight from stone and empire. We look at Rome and think of conquest. We look at Egypt and think of pyramids. We look at Mesopotamia and think of writing. But those definitions were written by historians in another age, when power, territory, and monuments were the yardsticks of greatness. Today, our perspective has shifted. At least, it should. Because the values we hold now, human rights, equality, sustainability, change how we look at the past, and they should also change how we measure greatness in the present. Think about Rome again. The Colosseum is often celebrated as a marvel of architecture, but peel back the stone and you see the cost. Tens of thousands of people enslaved, forced to fight animals or each other for entertainment. Gladiator games weren't sport. They were human sacrifice dressed as theater. From our perspective, is that greatness or cruelty carved into marble? Look at Greece, hailed as the birthplace of democracy. But it was a democracy only for a few. Women couldn't vote. Slaves were everywhere. Foreigners had no voice. The same society that gave us philosophy also normalized inequality on a massive scale. From their point of view, that was normal. From ours, it's hard not to see it as deeply flawed. Does that mean Greece wasn't great? Not exactly. But it means greatness is not as clean and shining as the history books suggest. And then there's environmental stewardship. Ancient societies rarely cared about sustainability the way we think of it today, but some did better than others. The Indus Valley civilization managed its cities with careful water systems and urban planning that minimized chaos. They built without massive monuments, without glorifying rulers, and they endured for centuries. Compare that to Mesopotamia, where irrigation slowly salted the soil, collapsing agriculture and leading to famine. Which one was greater, the society that left ziggurats, or the one that quietly built sustainable cities without fanfare? Our perspective forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Egypt built pyramids that lasted millennia. But should we celebrate a society that drained its people to glorify kings while most citizens lived short, brutal lives? Rome spread its culture across 3 continents. But should we celebrate an empire that enslaved millions and collapsed under its own inequality? Even the so-called golden ages shine darker when we put them under modern light. Here's the hybrid edge. Maybe what we call greatness is often just scale. Big buildings, big empires, big armies. But scale without humanity isn't greatness, it's domination. And domination always comes with a cost. Human suffering, ecological collapse, cycles of war. The ruins we celebrate were built on backs we rarely acknowledge. So what happens when we redefine greatness through our lens? We begin to see new candidates, societies that valued balance over conquest, knowledge over monuments, resilience over expansion. Indigenous cultures that thrived for thousands of years without over-consuming their environments. Small societies that left no pyramids but lived sustainably and peacefully. Civilizations that preserved knowledge, art, or spirituality rather, than chasing empire. This doesn't mean we erase Rome or Egypt from history. It means we stop treating them as the only models. Their greatness was partial at best, tragic at worst. And maybe, just maybe, we should start recognizing that the measure of greatness is not what lasts in stone, but what endures in principle. Modern perspective shift makes us face an unsettling truth. If future civilizations judge us by our values, not our skyscrapers, what will they say? Will they see a society that celebrated equality, or one that let inequality explode? Will they see a society that managed its environment, or one that burned the planet for short-term gain? Will they see human rights, or will they see exploitation, wrapped in profit? Because here's the paradox. We think we're the most advanced civilization in history, but by the very values we claim to cherish, justice, sustainability, equality, we may not look great at all. And one day, if our ruins are all that survive, future archaeologists might marvel at our towers while shaking their heads at our failures. Maybe that's the real shift. Greatness isn't about what looks impressive. It's about what endures, without shame. And if we take that seriously, then many of the civilizations we celebrate weren't as great as we think, and ours may not be either. When we talk about civilizations, we love to split them into winners and losers. Rome was great, the Indus Valley failed. Egypt was glorious, the Maya collapsed. We frame history like a scoreboard. Who rose, who conquered, who left monuments, who vanished. But this way of thinking blinds us. It hides the nuance, because the truth is, failure isn't always failure. Sometimes a society disappears not because it was weak, but because it chose balance over conquest, or because natural forces reshaped its world. And sometimes what we call failure is simply change we don't fully understand. Take the Indus Valley civilization. Textbooks often call it a mystery because it collapsed around 1900 BCE. Its great cities, Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, faded. Its writing system remains undeciphered, so we assume failure. But look closer. The Indus people built cities with advanced sanitation systems, grid planning, and water management thousands of years before Rome. Their houses had private baths. Their streets were organized. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, they left behind no giant temples or monuments to kings. Why? Maybe because their society was more egalitarian. Power didn't flow into a single ruler's hands. It was distributed. And when climate shifts changed the rivers, the people didn't vanish. They adapted, spread into villages, shifted to new ways of life. That's not failure. That's survival. But because they left no towering ruins, history calls them forgotten. Then, there's the Maya. Popular imagination says they disappeared. Abandoned cities, swallowed by jungle, collapse, failure, mystery. But the Maya didn't vanish. Their descendants still live in Central America today, speaking Mayan languages, practicing traditions. What collapsed were the cities, the monumental, urban centers strained by warfare, drought, and overpopulation, but the culture endured. It simply transformed. Calling the Maya a failed civilization is like saying the United States failed if New York City were abandoned. It's not failure, it's change. But our obsession with ruins turns transformation into tragedy. Even Rome, often held up as the archetype of greatness, is a lesson in nuance. The fall of Rome in 476 CE wasn't a sudden collapse into darkness. The eastern half, Byzantium, thrived for another 1,000 years. Roman law, architecture, and infrastructure carried on in fragments across Europe. People adapted, survived, evolved. To call it a failure ignores the continuity. Collapse wasn't the end, it was a reshaping. Why does this matter? Because if we only define success as leaving behind giant monuments and centralized empires, then we dismiss societies that may have been healthier, fairer, or more sustainable. We equate longevity with greatness, but we forget that longevity can come in many forms. A society that quietly thrives for millennia without leaving ruins may be far more successful than one that burns bright and collapses spectacularly. Here's the darker twist. Sometimes what we call greatness is failure in disguise. Rome's empire lasted centuries, but it collapsed under its own inequality and corruption. Egypt's dynasties built wonders, but often by exploiting thousands of laborers. Mesopotamia invented writing, but it also salted its soil into famine. These civilizations achieved much, but they also sowed their own destruction. Meanwhile, so-called lesser societies that never built monuments may have lived sustainably, in balance with their environment, for far longer. Their lack of ruins isn't proof of failure. It may be proof they didn't need them. Think about this in modern terms. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, what would archaeologists see? Skyscrapers, highways, nuclear plants, endless plastic. They might assume we were great because our ruins are massive. But what if our greatness is actually our failure? Our inability to sustain ourselves, our hubris in burning the planet for growth. Greatness judged by ruins is greatness without context. It's the loudest civilizations getting all the credit even if they destroyed themselves. Reframing failure changes the whole picture. The Indus didn't fail. They adapted. The Maya didn't disappear. They transformed. Byzantium didn't collapse. It survived in another form. And countless indigenous societies across the world, dismissed as primitive because they left no stone, thrived for millennia in balance with their environment until conquest disrupted them. Their failure was not internal collapse, it was invasion. So the question becomes, why do we love calling civilizations failures? Maybe because it flatters us. If Rome fell, but we still stand, then we must be smarter, stronger, more advanced. If the Maya disappeared, but we build satellites, then we must be superior. But history isn't a contest, it's a mosaic. And calling civilizations failures erases the parts of the mosaic that don't fit the narrative of linear progress. Here's the unsettling truth. Our own society will one day be called a failure. Whether it takes centuries or decades, our systems will strain, break, transform. The question is not if, it's how. Will future generations look back at us the way we look at the Maya, confused by abandoned cities? Or will they look at us the way we look at the Indus, puzzled by a vanished order, but impressed by how pieces of it endured? Maybe failure isn't the right word at all. Maybe the real failure is in how we tell the story. When people hear the phrase great civilizations, the same names appear every time: Rome, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, China. They dominate the narrative, not just because they achieved remarkable things, but because they left visible scars on the earth. Pyramids, walls, colosseums, written records. But history is much bigger than its loudest ruins. There are countless civilizations that thrived, innovated, endured, and yet remain invisible in our textbooks. They're the lesser knowns, forgotten not because they were unworthy, but because they didn't leave monuments that survived the erosion of time. Take the indigenous cultures of North America. For centuries, historians portrayed them as primitive, as scattered tribes living in wilderness. But archaeology and oral traditions tell a different story. The Mississippian culture built Cahokia, a massive urban center near modern St. Louis, complete with earthen pyramids, trade networks stretching across the continent, and complex governance. At its height, Cahokia rivaled the population of medieval London. Yet because its monuments were earth instead of stone, most of it eroded. For centuries, it was ignored. Greatness literally melted back into the soil, while the pyramids of Giza still stood. Or look at the Polynesians. Without metal tools, without writing, without compasses, they navigated the vast Pacific Ocean and settled islands thousands of miles apart. They used the stars, waves, birds, and subtle changes in the sea. Their navigational knowledge was so advanced that even modern sailors struggled to replicate it without instruments. Yet because this knowledge lived in memory and tradition, not in stone, it was dismissed as myth until modern experiments proved its genius. Greatness invisible, fragile yet undeniable. Then there's Africa. Western narratives often reduce African history to Egypt alone, as if nothing else of importance happened on the continent. But kingdoms like Mali, Songhai, and Great Zimbabwe tell another story. Mali's capital, Timbuktu, housed libraries with thousands of manuscripts on science, law, and philosophy, rivaling Europe's medieval universities. Great Zimbabwe built massive stone enclosures without mortar, engineering marvels in their own right. Oral dynasties preserved genealogies and histories with precision. But because colonialism erased, looted, or dismissed much of this, these civilizations were written out of the global narrative. Their greatness was real. Our blindness was the problem. Even in Europe, lesser knowns exist. The Minoans of Crete built sophisticated palaces with plumbing, trade routes, and art that celebrated not war, but nature. Their frescoes show dolphins, lilies and dances, an entirely different cultural priority than conquest. They thrived for centuries before natural disasters and invasions reshaped them. Yet in popular imagination, they barely exist, overshadowed by Greece and Rome. Greatness defined by harmony, not conquest, lost in the margins. The pattern is everywhere. The Ainu of Japan, with their deep ecological knowledge. The San of southern Africa, with oral traditions stretching back tens of thousands of years. The Andean cultures before the Inca, who developed terracing and agricultural systems that fed millions in high-altitude landscapes. Each of these societies excelled in ways that didn't leave behind skyscrapers or armies. Their greatness was fragile, invisible, and therefore easy to erase. Here's the darker truth. What we call great civilizations are often just the ones whose ruins shouted loud enough to survive. The rest are buried, forgotten, or dismissed. That's not history, that's survival bias. We've mistaken durability for greatness, stone for wisdom, conquest for culture, and in doing so, we blind ourselves to lessons we desperately need. The Mississippians show us that urban life doesn't have to rely on stone to be sophisticated. The Polynesians remind us that sustainability and navigation can come from harmony with nature, not domination of it. African kingdoms prove that intellectual greatness can thrive outside Europe's shadow. The Minoans remind us that a culture can celebrate life rather than glorify war. These aren't footnotes. They're alternate definitions of greatness, ones we've ignored because they don't fit the story we wanted to tell. So here's the unsettling question. How many other great civilizations are still missing? How many cultures left no ruins, no libraries, no monuments, only memory, stories, and whispers? We will never know their names. We will never know their achievements. And that should humble us, because it means our version of history is not just incomplete, it's biased toward what survives, not what mattered. That's the hybrid edge. Maybe greatness isn't what survives. Maybe greatness is what resists. Collapse, what lives in balance, what carries wisdom even if it leaves no ruins. If that's true, then the societies we call lesser known may actually have been the greatest of all. And here's where it comes back to us. We think our skyscrapers guarantee memory. But what if we're wrong? What if our greatness is invisible to the future because it doesn't endure? What if the civilizations we dismiss as fragile were actually more advanced in the only metric that matters, survival? History has been telling us the same thing for centuries. We just haven't been listening. History is often presented to us as a finished book. Dates, names, and civilizations are lined up in neat timelines, as if the meaning is already decided. Rome was great, Egypt was mighty, Mesopotamia was first. That's how it's taught, and so that's how we believe it. But the truth is, history is not a closed book. It's a puzzle with missing pieces. And how we choose to arrange those pieces, what we emphasize and what we ignore, is up to interpretation. Which means the definition of greatness is not set in stone. It's shaped by us. Think about it. Why do we celebrate Rome more than the Indus Valley? Why do we remember the pyramids of Egypt but not the astronomical knowledge of the Polynesians? Why do textbooks devote chapters to Greece but only paragraphs to Mali? It's not because one was objectively greater. It's because our culture, our historians, our institutions decided what mattered. And those decisions are not neutral. They're shaped by bias, by power, by the same survival bias that preserves monuments while erasing oral traditions. That's why personal interpretation matters. If you accept the textbook story as fact, you inherit a narrow definition of greatness: empire, monuments, conquest. But if you question it, if you look closer, if you listen to the whispers from forgotten cultures, you start to see history differently. You realize greatness might also mean sustainability, wisdom, resilience, creativity. You realize that the absence of ruins doesn't equal the absence of greatness. This is empowering but also unsettling. It means there is no single true definition of greatness. There are many, and which one we choose shapes not only how we see the past, but how we imagine the future. If greatness means conquest, then our societies will chase conquest. If greatness means sustainability, then we'll chase balance. If greatness means wisdom, then we'll chase knowledge. The stories we tell about the past become the blueprints we unconsciously follow in the present. Here's the darker twist. If we don't question the definition, we risk repeating its failures. If we keep equating greatness with expansion and monuments, we'll keep building societies that grow too fast, exploit too much, and collapse under their own weight. That's the hidden cost of accepting someone else's definition of greatness. It locks us into a cycle we may not survive. Personal interpretation, then, isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's survival. When you look at Rome, do you see glory or warning? When you look at Egypt, do you see eternity or exploitation? When you look at the Maya, do you see disappearance or endurance? How you answer those questions changes how you see yourself, your culture, your civilization. And here's the irony. We live in a time when interpretation is more accessible than ever. With a phone in your hand, you can read sources from every corner of the globe, listen to indigenous voices, explore forgotten sites, challenge textbook narratives. You are not bound to the story written by 19th century historians who valued empire above all else. You can write your own. That's the power of personal interpretation. You're not just a passive consumer of history, you're a participant in it. By choosing which stories to elevate, which definitions to challenge, you shape the narrative of human greatness itself. And that narrative is not just about the past, it's about what future generations will inherit. So, when you think about great civilizations, don't just repeat what you've been told. Ask yourself, who decided this was great? What voices were silenced? What stories were ignored? Because every time you question, every time you reinterpret, you reclaim a little more of the truth, and you redefine what greatness really means. And maybe, just maybe, that's the first step to building a civilization that won't just leave ruins, but will leave wisdom. When you hear the phrase, a great civilization, what flashes into your mind? Pyramids against a desert sky, legions marching under Roman banners, the Great Wall stretching across the mountains, maybe glittering towers of glass in modern cities? That reaction matters because it reveals what you've been taught to value. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Greatness is not objective, it's a choice. And whether you realize it or not, you're already carrying a definition of greatness inside you, one that shapes how you see both the past and the future. The textbooks encourage you to think of greatness as scale, bigger armies, bigger buildings, bigger borders. But step back for a moment. Is bigger always better? Was Rome really greater than the Polynesians who mastered the open ocean without compasses? Was Egypt's greatness only in its pyramids, or also in its centuries of continuity and resilience? Was the Maya's collapse a failure, or was their survival in smaller, adapted communities just another form of greatness? This is where it gets personal, because your definition of greatness isn't just an opinion, it's a lens. If you define greatness as conquest, you'll admire empires. If you define greatness as balance, you'll admire cultures that lived in harmony with their environment. If you define greatness as creativity, you'll admire societies that left behind art, stories, and ideas rather than weapons and ruins. And here's the twist. None of those choices are wrong, but whichever one you choose will tell you as much about yourself as it does about history. So ask yourself, what impresses you more, stone or survival? A civilization that built monuments so large they still stand, or one that quietly endured for thousands of years without collapse? A society that conquered half the world, or one that created ideas so resilient they outlived empires? Is greatness the size of your army or the depth of your wisdom? The danger is that if you don't think about it, the choice is made for you. Culture, education, and media push one version of greatness: the loud, the monumental, the conquering. And without realizing it, you inherit that definition. You admire ruins but not stories. You value monuments but not balance. You see collapse as failure instead of transformation. In short, you absorb a script written centuries ago and never stop to ask if it makes sense. Here's the darker edge. If we all keep accepting the wrong definition, we build civilizations in its image. If greatness means power, we chase endless growth, bigger armies, taller towers, until the system cracks. If greatness means monuments, we pour resources into concrete and steel while ignoring sustainability. If greatness means wealth, we widen inequality and call it progress. In other words, our definition of greatness becomes our destiny, and if it's the wrong one, it leads us straight into collapse. That's why your personal reflection matters, because history isn't just something that happened, it's something we use to decide who we want to be. When you admire Rome, you're not just admiring the past, you're quietly endorsing conquest as a measure of success. When you admire the Polynesians, you're endorsing balance and resilience. When you admire Mali's libraries, you're endorsing wisdom and knowledge. These choices ripple outward. They influence how societies teach history, how leaders justify power, and how people imagine the future. So pause here. Think about it. What does great mean to you? Is it endurance? Is it wisdom? Is it sustainability? Or is it domination, expansion, and spectacle? There's no neutral answer, because every choice privileges one kind of civilization over another, and every choice has consequences. Maybe greatness is measured by what we leave behind. Maybe it's measured by what we protect. Maybe it's not about surviving for thousands of years, but about how we treat others while we're here. Maybe a civilization that never built pyramids, but treated its people with fairness and lived in balance with nature, was greater than the empires that left monuments but collapsed in cruelty. And here's the haunting twist. One day, our civilization will be judged too. Future generations, if there are any, will look back and ask, were they great? And their answer won't just depend on our skyscrapers, satellites, or nuclear arsenals. It will depend on the values we chose. Did we define greatness as domination or as stewardship? Did we define it as wealth or as wisdom? Did we leave ruins or did we leave lessons? The call is simple. Don't let someone else decide what greatness means for you. Define it yourself, because that definition will shape how you see history, how you live in the present, and what kind of future you help to build. So again, what does great mean to you? Every civilization believed it was building forever. Rome thought its empire would last as long as the sun. Egypt's pharaohs filled tombs with treasures meant to endure eternity. The Maya built calendars stretching thousands of years into the future. And yet, here we are, looking at ruins, piecing together fragments, wondering how it all unraveled. If there's one lesson history should scream at us, it's this: no civilization is immune, and that includes ours. So the question isn't whether we'll leave ruins. We will. The question is, what else will we leave behind? What will future generations, if they exist, say about us? Will they say we were great because we built towers of steel and networks of satellites? Or will they shake their heads, wondering how we could be so blind, burning our environment, hoarding wealth, ignoring inequality, chasing monuments while the ground beneath us cracked? Looking forward, we have a choice. We can cling to the old definition of greatness, power, scale, monuments, and follow the same path of rise and collapse. Or we can redefine greatness on our own terms, not as domination, but as endurance, not as conquest, but as compassion, not as monuments of stone, but as legacies of wisdom, because greatness that collapses isn't greatness at all. It's spectacle, and spectacle fades. What would it mean to build a civilization truly worthy of the word great? Maybe it means designing cities that don't poison the air or water. Maybe it means creating economies that lift everyone instead of a few. Maybe it means embedding sustainability so deeply into our culture that collapse becomes the exception, not the rule. Maybe it means teaching future generations not just how to build towers, but how to keep them standing without burning the world to ash. And here's the darker edge. If we don't redefine greatness, nature will do it for us. Rising seas don't care about skyscrapers. Shifting climates don't care about GDP. A fragile power grid doesn't care about who has the biggest army. The old markers of greatness, wealth, expansion, technology, mean nothing if they can't withstand collapse. The ruins of tomorrow will look a lot like the ruins of yesterday, impressive but empty. But imagine the alternative. Imagine if our legacy wasn't just concrete and plastic, but wisdom. Imagine if archaeologists, thousands of years from now, found not just ruins, but signs of a society that learned from the past, that broke the cycle. They wouldn't marvel at our tallest towers. They'd marvel at the fact that we didn't collapse when so many others did, that we survived, endured, and adapted, that we finally redefined greatness not as what dazzled, but as what endured. That's the challenge, and it's personal. Because every definition of greatness starts with individuals, with you. If you decide greatness means sustainability, you'll value it in leaders, in communities, in choices. If you decide greatness means wisdom, you'll look for it in stories, ideas, and legacies. And if enough people redefine greatness, the culture shifts, the blueprint changes, the future bends. Looking forward, we're at a crossroads. One path leads to ruins that future generations will puzzle over, shaking their heads at our hubris. The other leads to something rarer, a civilization remembered not for collapse, but for continuity. Not for what it built, but for what it preserved. Not for power, but for wisdom. So ask yourself, what kind of greatness do you want to leave behind? The monuments of yesterday or the resilience of tomorrow? Because the future isn't waiting. We're writing the definition of greatness right. Now, with every decision, every policy, every story we choose to believe, and that's the lesson of history. Greatness isn't guaranteed, it's chosen. And if we choose wisely, maybe, just maybe, we'll be the first civilization remembered not for how we fell, but for how we endured. We've walked through ruins, through myths, through forgotten coastlines and buried stones. We've seen how every civilization calls itself great, and how every one of them eventually crumbles into silence. Rome burned, Egypt eroded, Mesopotamia turned to dust. The Maya transformed, the Indus adapted, countless others simply vanished without leaving a trace. And yet, we keep asking the same question. What makes a civilization great? Maybe the truth is simpler and harder than we like to admit. Greatness is not written in monuments or measured in conquests. Greatness is not the tallest tower, the biggest army, or the loudest empire, because all of those fade. What endures are the choices, how we treated one another, how we lived with our environment, what wisdom we passed forward. If those things are weak, no amount of stone will save us. That's the warning hidden in history. Every ruin is not just a memory, it's a mirror. When we look at them, we aren't just seeing the past, we're seeing a preview of ourselves. The fragility, the hubris, the arrogance of believing collapse can't happen here, can't happen now. But the ruins whisper otherwise. They tell us collapse is not the exception, it's the rule. So what makes us different? Maybe nothing, unless we choose. Unless we decide that greatness isn't about what dazzles, but what endures. Unless we value wisdom as much as wealth, balance as much as power, stewardship as much as progress. Unless we learn to see greatness not in ruins, but in resilience. Because here's the haunting truth. The ruins of tomorrow are already being built today. Our skyscrapers, our grids, our monuments of steel, their future archaeology. And someday, someone may stand among their fragments and ask the same question we're asking now. Were they truly great, or were they just loud? That's the choice in front of us. And it's not Rome's choice, not Egypt's choice, not Mesopotamia's choice. It's ours, right here, right now. So I'll leave you with one question, the only one that matters. When history remembers us, what story will it tell? Will it tell